The Arizona desert stretched for miles in every direction, painted gold by the sinking sun. The wind whispered through the brittle grass, carrying with it the scent of dust and memory. On a lonely stretch of land, far from any town or trail, stood a small wooden ranch house, weathered, silent, and strong against time. That was where Jack Callahan, a retired cowboy, lived out his final years. He had once been a legend across the frontier, a sharpshooter, a cattleman, and a man who had fought through both war and heartbreak. Now, all that remained of him was a shadow of his former self, a man who spoke little and worked hard from dawn until dusk. His horse, Dusty, was his only friend, and the old barn his only company when the desert nights grew cold. Jack had built his life on solitude. He told himself it was easier that way, no one to lose, no one to bury, no one to remember. His wife had died decades ago, taken by fever. His son had gone east and never ridden back. And so, Jack had buried his emotions like he buried the dead, deep beneath the dry soil of the West. Then, one evening, as a storm gathered over the horizon, something changed. He heard voices, soft, desperate, unfamiliar. When he stepped onto his porch, he saw 5 women walking slowly through the rain, wrapped in torn blankets, their faces marked with exhaustion and grief. Their dark hair was tangled, their feet bare and bleeding from miles of walking. They were Apache widows, left behind after years of conflict, when the army had burned their village and taken their men. Most settlers despised them, calling them cursed, dangerous, or worse. But when Jack looked at them, he didn't see enemies, he saw human souls who had lost everything, just as he once had. The leader of the group, a tall woman with strong, sorrowful eyes, stepped forward. She spoke broken English. "We need shelter," she said. "No food, no place to go." Jack hesitated. The old part of him, the part that still remembered battles and prejudice, wanted to shut the door and walk away. The world didn't take kindly to a white man helping Apaches. The townsfolk already called him crazy for living alone. But then, as lightning flashed across the sky, he saw one of the women clutching a small child close to her chest, trying to shield it from the rain. Something inside him cracked open. He didn't answer at first, just turned and opened the door. "Come in," he said quietly. "Ain't much, but it's dry." The women stepped inside, shivering and silent. Jack gave them blankets, lit the fire, and watched as they sat near the warmth, whispering prayers in a language he didn't understand. The storm raged outside, but for the first time in years, the old cabin didn't feel empty. Jack Callahan didn't know it yet, but that night would change his life, and his heart, forever. Morning came quietly over the desert. The storm had passed, leaving the air sharp and clean, and the scent of wet earth rose from the ground. Jack Callahan stepped outside his cabin, the sound of boots pressing into mud breaking the stillness. For years, he had woken to nothing but silence, but that morning, the quiet was filled with new sounds. The crackle of a fire. The soft murmurs of women speaking Apache. A baby crying. Inside, the 5 widows moved carefully around the small cabin, as if afraid to disturb the ghosts of the place. The eldest, Nokoma, helped tend the fire while another, Lita, washed the dirt from her child's face using a tin bowl of rainwater. They were proud women, worn by hardship, but not broken. Jack could see it in their eyes, a mix of fear, pride, and the unyielding will to survive. He didn't know what to say to them. Words felt heavy after so many years alone. But he did what he could, brought in wood, poured coffee, and left his bread and beans on the table. None of the women touched the food at first. Finally, the one holding the child spoke softly. "You are not afraid." Jack looked at her for a long time. "I've been afraid of a lot of things," he said. "But not people who need help." That broke the ice. Slowly, trust began to grow, unspoken, fragile, but real. The women began helping with chores without being asked. They swept the floor, cleaned the barn, and fetched water from the creek. Nokoma even mended Jack's torn shirt using deer sinew, her hands moving with practiced precision. At first, Jack kept his distance. He wasn't used to company. He found himself watching them from the porch, seeing how they laughed quietly among themselves, how they shared food, how they prayed every sunset. For the first time in decades, his home felt alive, like something worth keeping clean, worth coming back to at the end of a long day. Days turned into weeks. Jack noticed how one of the younger women, Taya, would follow him to the corral, watching him work with the horses. She didn't speak much English, but she learned fast. When he showed her how to brush Dusty's mane, she smiled, a small, grateful smile that reminded him of something long forgotten. The ranch began to change too. What had once been lifeless land slowly came back to life. The women planted herbs behind the cabin. They painted simple tribal symbols on stones near the fence, their way of blessing the place. At night, they sat by the fire, sharing stories, hers in Apache, his in broken bits of memory. Jack told them about his late wife, about the wars, about the loneliness that followed him like a shadow. And though they didn't always understand his words, they understood his heart. For the first time in 20 years, Jack Callahan didn't feel like a ghost of the frontier anymore. He felt human again, and somewhere deep inside, a feeling he'd buried long ago began to stir, something like hope. By the time spring rolled in, the ranch had changed completely. Where once only dust and silence ruled, now came the sound of laughter, of hammers striking wood, of a child's giggle echoing between the barns. Jack Callahan had built new shelters with the help of the Apache widows, and together they turned his lonely stretch of land into a small, living home. But peace never lasts long in the Wild West. Word began to spread, first through the saloon in Red Creek, then through the church, and finally across every porch and pasture for 20 miles. The old cowboy who'd lived alone for years was now living with 5 Apache women. The whispers turned sharp, then cruel. "Can't trust an Indian," the blacksmith muttered one morning. "Those women killed our soldiers," said another man in the tavern. And by nightfall, someone had painted a crude warning on Jack's fence post, "No savages." Jack found it at dawn, dried red paint dripping like blood. He stared at the message for a long time, then scraped it off with his knife. His hands didn't shake, but his heart did. He knew the hatred that still ran deep through the West. He'd seen it during the wars, had even fought in them once. But now, standing before his home, he realized how blind he'd been to the suffering on the other side. That evening, when Nokoma saw his face, she asked softly, "They know we are here?" Jack nodded. "They know." The firelight danced across her features, shadows falling over her weary eyes. "Then they will come." She was right. Within days, riders appeared on the ridge, 3 men from town. They stopped at the gate, sneers painted across their faces. Their leader, Clay Morris, spat tobacco onto the dirt. "Didn't think we'd have to tell you this, Callahan," he said. "But you can't keep them here. They're not your kind." Jack stood, silent, his weathered hand resting on his revolver's worn handle, not to threaten, but to remind them that he wasn't afraid. "They've done no harm," he said quietly. Clay smirked. "They don't have to. Their kind brings trouble just by breathing." The tension thickened like the air before a storm. But Jack didn't back down. "You tell the town this is my land," he said. "And anyone who steps on it to hurt them will answer to me." The men laughed, but there was something in Jack's voice, steady, unbending, that made them turn their horses around and ride off. That night, the widows prayed around the fire, their voices soft and mournful. Jack sat with them, staring into the flames. For the first time, he realized this wasn't just about shelter anymore. It was about justice, about humanity. In that moment, surrounded by those he'd once been taught to fear, the old cowboy made a silent vow. No one would harm them, not while he still drew breath. Outside, the desert wind howled against the window panes, carrying the sound of distant thunder. Trouble was coming to the Callahan ranch, and Jack was ready to face it. The storm came the next night, not from the sky, but from the town. Clouds rolled over the plains, the wind howling through the cottonwoods like a warning. Jack Callahan felt it in his bones. He'd seen that kind of quiet before, right before bullets started flying. By sunset, Nokoma was inside with the others, tending the baby and whispering prayers in Apache. The ranch dogs barked wildly near the fence. Jack walked out with his lantern, its glow flickering across the empty yard. That's when he saw them, 5 riders at the ridge, torches burning bright against the dark. Clay Morris was in front, a shotgun slung across his shoulder. "Told you, old man," he shouted through the wind. "You got until tonight to send those women away. We ain't asking again." Jack didn't move. The light from the torch cast his face in half shadow, deep lines marking every year of loss and silence he'd lived. "They're staying," he said flatly. One of the riders spat. "Then you'll burn with them." The torches dropped to the dry grass. Flames erupted, racing toward the barn. Jack didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle, the crack of gunfire echoing through the valley. One torch fell, another man shouted in pain. The widows screamed from the cabin. Nokoma rushed outside with a bucket of water, Lita right behind her, trying to fight the spreading fire. But Jack was old, and they were many. The men circled the ranch, smoke rising thick and choking. He took cover behind a wagon, his revolver trembling in his hand, not from fear, but from age. Then, through the chaos, he heard the cry of the child. He turned. Flames were crawling up the cabin wall. Without a thought, he ran inside. Nokoma tried to stop him, shouting in her native tongue, but he pushed past her. The heat was unbearable, the smoke blinding. He found the baby in a cradle, wrapped in a quilt. Coughing, half blinded, he grabbed the child and stumbled out the back door, collapsing near the corral. The riders were gone. Maybe fear, maybe guilt, maybe the realization that they'd gone too far. The rain came then, heavy, cold, saving what was left of the ranch. By morning, the barn was gone, half the cabin blackened, but everyone was alive. Jack lay weak beneath a tree, the baby safe in his arms, Nokoma kneeling beside him. She pressed his weathered hand to her heart and whispered something he didn't understand. But the way she said it, he knew what it meant, thank you. Days later, the sheriff came. The townsfolk stayed silent, no one spoke against Jack Callahan again. When the ranch was rebuilt, it wasn't his anymore, it was theirs. The Apache widows stayed, working the land, raising their children, tending the graves of the past. Jack Callahan never left. His rocking chair stayed on the porch, his rifle beside it, and his story became a whisper carried by the desert wind, a tale of an old cowboy who found his heart again in the most unlikely way. And every spring, when the wildflowers bloomed near his resting place, the women would say softly, "He gave us shelter, and we gave him peace."